All together. So we were trying to think of a creative way that we could, keep our streak, right? 36 years running. We didn't want to break the streak. So we partnered with our neighbors up the road at Dye Mansion to do a virtual field trip to kind of give us some insights into Jefferson, America. Of course, we're maybe featuring George Washington a little bit more than we normally would because of his historic significance with Dye Mansion, but we figured it still fits under the umbrella of trying to understand the critical aspects of revolutionary and early national America that are at the heart of the mission of this longstanding lecture series. So we've got some exciting, innovative, unique programming that we put together. If you can see from my background, I am virtually in the Dye Mansion, where I have spoken about women's roles and the family economy, and happy to kind of share more of my insights about that in a minute. But what I want to do before we get started with the actual programming is just allow Dan Baker, who is from our admissions office here at William Patterson, to give you all a special welcome. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan for a moment now.
Good morning. Thanks, Dr. McMahon, for having me here today, and welcome. It's so great to see so many participants in our session today. Again, my name is Dan Baker, one of the Associate Directors of Undergraduate Admissions. This is an event I always love attending on campus to learn from great guest speakers and connect with so many students when we are on campus. But I want to thank everybody for being here today. Just wanted to welcome everybody and let everybody know that if you're interested in studying at William Patterson University, we're here to help you in the admissions office. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email into the chat box so you can see that. So if any students want to connect with me later on today after the program or at any point during the admission cycle, please feel free to check out our campus visit page. We are hosting a combination of socially distanced on-campus programming, as well as plenty of virtual programming as well too. Especially if you're interested in history, I'll be working with Dr. McMahon to put together specific Zoom virtual events so you can come back and learn more specifically about the William Patterson History Department sometime during our spring semester. And we do offer many of those for other majors. So again, welcome. I hope you enjoy the session today. And again, I will pop my email into the chat box. So thank you everybody for coming today.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. In fact, I will be teaching a class on early national America in the spring. And so I would love to have, maybe arrange a visit to do some virtual programming associated with that. That'd be great, actually. It's a way of kind of continuing this new programming that we're developing in response to the circumstances that we now find ourselves into. All right, so we're going to get started with our program. Again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. I should introduce myself. I am Dr. Lucia McMahon. I am the program coordinator for the Thomas Jefferson Abraham Carch Lecture Series. As I mentioned earlier, that's been ongoing at William Patterson for the past 36 years. I haven't been in charge of it for all 36 years, but I'm very happy to be in charge of it now. I'm also a professor of history at William Patterson University, as well as currently serving as the chair of the history department. So I wear a lot of hats and very happy to be here today, though maybe getting to do one of the most favorite things that I could possibly do as an academic and as a scholar, and that is to talk about women's lives and experiences in early national America, which is my area of scholarly specialization. I want to take a moment to introduce the other panelists who will be joining me today. We have other faculty members from William Patterson here, as well as members of the Dye Mansion staff. So you can join me in welcoming Louis Picone, who teaches history classes for us here and who is a published author on the many lives of the presidents, who's going to share our expertise about our first president today, or our first official president, right? We can get into a whole debate over that, right? Because Louis has also researched the presidents of the Continental Congress before we had George Washington's presidents. We have Steve Pellegrini here, who is a also teaches for us at history and is also a historical reenactor. So he is able to provide some of that um, sort of imagined first person experience of what life would be like at Washington's headquarters, and for the experiences of everyday soldiers in the Continental Army and the militia. And then joining us from the mansion, we have Jessica Bush and Kelly McManus, and is Kelly Riffles here as well? I can't keep track of all the people, which is good because there's so many people joining us, which is awesome. And Jessica and the two Kellys, or at least one Kelly that I see, are in charge of educational programming and cultural events at Dimension, and really have just, if you're not familiar with Dimension, which is located, right up the road from William Patterson, it's such a fabulous cultural historic spot. It has been, the site of Washington's headquarters during the Revolutionary War at 2 different spots in 1780. It's just a fabulous place and space, and they do a lot of great programming, and we're just so excited that we're getting to partner with them on this project today, and that we're hoping that this is the first of very many continued events, both virtual and in person, as we get able to host in-person events again, hopefully by the spring or fall of next year. So Jim Miles, I'd also like to give a special shout out to. He is our Director of Digital Learning at William Patterson University, has been really instrumental in helping us with this transition to digital and virtual platforms. And so Jim, is the chat going to be open now, or for people who are interested in asking questions, or sort of just?
Yes, the chat will come directly to the co-hosts, and I will read off the questions. So those of you on the panel won't have to worry about looking at the chat box. So feel free to ask any questions, and we'll get them to our panelists, or you can feel free to use the raise hand icon, and we will open up your mic so you can ask them directly.
Okay. So I guess the question I have is how many people were able to already take a look at the videos that we shared, which sort of provide various perspectives on the mansion? We have, there are actually 4 videos that we shared the link with, that is sort of the kicking off point of this various collaboration and project. And what we are trying to do with those videos and with the sort of Q&A that we'll talk about today is sort of provide a virtual field trip, right? We unfortunately, Dimension and other spots throughout the state remain closed due to the pandemic related restrictions. So we thought, if you can't go to this wonderful historic home, we can bring this home to you, right? So, so there are 4 short videos that hopefully you got a chance to watch before this morning's programming, but if not, absolutely. And so we just threw up a quick poll just to see how many of you were able to take a look at those videos before today's talk. And if you didn't, that's fine. I mean, they're there, they live on the website, you can see them at any time. But so we'll kind of start there, and then we'll see if you have any particular questions. But for those of you who weren't able to see the videos, let me just kind of briefly tell you about their content, so that you can kind of, maybe if you're thinking of questions you'd want to ask us, even use the content of the videos to help shape your questions. So there is an introductory video from Jessica Bush from Dimension, who just sort of takes you through the house, right? Like literally introduces you to the house. And I'm seeing the poll results come in. And so far it looks like, a lot of you weren't able to see the videos, which is fine, because I know we only got them out yesterday. So we might even, I'm thinking maybe we can even take the 5 minutes to show Jessica's video, because it's short and it provides a nice overview to the house. And then the other content is myself speaking from my background here, the Dimension family parlor, to talk about women's roles and the family economy during the era of the American Revolution. Louis Picone, who, as I said, is an expert in the presidency, who sort of breaks down what George Washington's time was like when he used the mansion as his military headquarters, who he brought with him, kind of how he scheduled his day. And then Steve Pellegrini, kind of, as I mentioned earlier, offering the perspective from the soldier, right? And the point of these videos is to kind of remind us that even at one spot, one space, such as Dye Mansion, there are so many multivaried perspectives and experiences to consider depending upon whose, eyes, you're viewing the house from. George Washington's experience of the house might be very different than an enlisted soldier's view of the encampment there versus the experiences of the women whose lives were kind of upended by these 50 or so unexpected house guests showing up, right? So how about, since the poll does reveal that a majority of people weren't able to see the videos, maybe we should start by just showing that brief video from Jessica. It's only 5 minutes, and it at least will kind of maybe give everyone the experience of seeing the house and seeing, just how beautiful this space is. And then hopefully that'll inspire some questions. So if you're thinking about questions, I encourage you to start also putting them into the chat. So Jim, I hate to put you on the spot like this, and also
No,
Jessica.
not a problem. I'm already ready to go.
To be a
I had the videos up just in case, so I'll roll those in a second. I just want, for those of you who don't know how to use the chat feature, I got a message reminding me to explain the chat feature down the bottom of your screen. You'll see chat. You just click that and type your question right there. It should come to me. Okay, so I will now play Jessica's video.
Great.
Welcome to the Dye Mansion, Washington's headquarters. What was once the home to Tunis and Hester Dye is now a historic house museum in Wayne, New Jersey. Tunis's great-grandfather was a soldier with the Dutch West India Company. He arrived in the American colonies in the mid-1600s. In 1717, Tunis's father purchases 600 acres in what was then called Preakness Valley. In 1764, upon his death, he willed the property to Tunis and his wife Hester, who then built the home that we see today, roughly mid-1770s. Tunis and Hester built this large manor home on approximately 600 acres of property, 300 of which was farmland and 300 of which remained forested. Tunis was wealthy. He was part of the New Jersey Assembly, and he was also a founding member of the Queens College, which is now Rutgers University. Together, Tunis and Hester had 10 children, 8 of whom survived into adulthood. They have 2 daughters and 6 sons. Inside the home, we also know that there were at least 3 people enslaved, one of whom's name was Phyllis. We don't know much about her life. We don't know much about the lives of the people that were enslaved here. But we do know that Phyllis exists based off of Tunis's will. Tunis was the colonel of the Bergen County militia. In the 1700s, this was all Bergen County. Passaic County doesn't exist until 1837. So in the American colonies, King George had required militias. All able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 45 were required to get together and practice in military tactics. This was so that they could defend themselves from attacks. Leading up to the war with England, not all colonists were siding with the revolutionaries. Some remained loyal to the king. In fact, about 1 in 3 people decided to stay loyal. Tunis and Hester's oldest daughter, Jane, was married to a man named Abraham Van Buskirk. Prior to the war, Van Buskirk was a surgeon with the Bergen County militia. When the war breaks out, Van Buskirk sides with the king, and he becomes a lieutenant colonel with the 4th Battalion of New Jersey Volunteers. Tunis and Hester never see their daughter Jane again. In the summer of 1780, the war has been going on for about 5 years. Tunis receives word from General George Washington that he'd like to use his home and his property as a headquarters and an encampment for his troops. The Dye family prepares their home for this influx of people. When Washington arrives in the summer of 1780, he doesn't come by himself. Traveling with him are 6 of his aides-de-camps. He's got roughly 40 to 50 of his lifeguard and about 2,500 troops that are going to encamp on the property. The Dye family, unlike other families, had a home large enough to accommodate this many people. They used this long center hallway as a dividing point, giving Washington and his aide-de-camps the east side of the house, while the family kept the west side of the house. Much like on the first floor, the second floor hallway served as a dividing point. The Dye family got one half of the house, and Washington and his overnight guests got the other half. Now, we don't know for sure how many of the Dye family members were living inside the home at the time that Washington was here, but we do know that Hester, her daughter-in-law, and 3 of her daughter-in-law's small children were living in the home at the time. They would have had to share one bedroom. Take a look at your own home and think about how you and your family might make accommodations for an event such as this. Now think about an 18th century home that did not have things like electricity, running water, no heating, and no air conditioning. We can take a look at some of the artifacts located in our museum to get a really good idea about what life was like during the 18th century. Items such as chamber pots and candlesticks and bed warmers remind us that they did not have the same luxuries that we have today. In total, Washington and his men are here for 3 months in 1780. They're here in July and then again in October and November. While they are here, they're treated to the comforts of home. They have servants to wash their clothing and prepare their meals. They have a roof over their head. This is a very different experience than the men and the women of the Continental Army. I encourage you to watch the series of educational videos that'll help you to learn more about the other people who were encamped here during this time.
Fabulous. So thank you so much to Jessica for that fabulous introduction to the mansion, and to Mr. Miles for making that technology possible. And as you can see from that sort of brief introduction, you get a sense of the space, and you kind of got brief glimpses into the rooms that we cover in more detail in the other videos. So I guess I'd invite you now to sort of ask any questions you might have in the chat, if there was a particular space or object that caught your attention that you'd like to know more about. If not, we're happy to just share things with you anyway. But it'd be great if we could start by sort of seeing if there was something that you were particularly curious about, right? I loved what Jessica said about sort of trying to imagine, this disruption to your daily life. And I think for some of us, we're living these disruptions to our daily life, right? We are trying to manage remote school, perhaps sharing space with family members who are trying to, be in different places at different times, sort of portioning off our home space to make sure that different activities can take place simultaneously. I mean, just from my own experience yesterday, my niece had to come over to use my house for a final exam that she had to take, because there was some last minute issue at her space, so that she wasn't able to work in her own space. So she needed a place to take her final, and so she had to come to my house, and, she's in the dining room working, and I'm up in my study on my meeting, right? And so, that's just sort of a small scale of what we're experiencing today. Of trying to rearrange our daily lives in order to make space. So I'd be curious if, from your own experiences, if you have any kind of questions about what that might have looked like 18th century style, right? To have to kind of reconfigure your living and working arrangements in order to, to make space for General George Washington and his many entourage of people and supplies that would have accompanied him. So have any questions come in?
They have.
Well,
okay, so
great.
I'm just going to start reading these in order, and you guys can decide, unless they're directed. A couple of them are directed specifically at some of our panelists.
Great, wonderful.
This is from George Robb. The video shows us how the officers lived. How did the regular soldiers live? What were their camps like?
All right, well, I guess we'll turn that one over to Steve Pellegrini. Oh, I think you need to be unmuted, Steve.
There we go. Okay.
Yep.
Hello. First of all, Dr. McMahon already introduced me, but I'm Stephen Pellegrini. I'm an adjunct professor at William Patterson University. And as Dr. McMahon already alluded, my specialty is in military history and specifically Bergen County during the American Revolution. So Washington and his officers would have enjoyed many privileges that average enlisted personnel would not have. So one of the things I always find funny about historical reenactments is that as good as the representation is, and as hard as reenactors try to accurately portray the lives of soldiers during the American Revolution, there are many aspects of reenactments that are not always, I know this could kind of be a loaded term, but authentic to the history, right? So if you find yourself at a historical reenactment and you are looking around the campsite, for example, you will notice that every soldier has their own tent, right? They have their own wedge tent. In reality, this would not have been the case. Most soldiers did not have their own wedge tent. They would have had to share it with about 3 or 4 other soldiers. If you've ever been in a military wedge tent, it's a very cramped space. There's not a lot of room. And if you imagine packing 3 or 4 different soldiers into a space like that, it could get very uncomfortable. By 1780, when Washington's army is encamped at the Dye Mansion, the supply situation that Washington's army had to face for much of the earlier part of the war had to some extent been rectified. So the rations of the soldiers would have been slightly better. Bergen County itself was a very prosperous, productive, wealthy part of the colony and later state of New Jersey. So it wouldn't have been difficult at all for Washington's army to procure supplies when they were in the area. So the food that soldiers were able to eat and access to necessities of life would have been better than you would have seen, for example, in the winters of 77 and 76, when Washington's army is on the ropes and he's in Valley Forge and so forth. So by this point in the war, the life of a Continental Army soldier or a Bergen County militiaman would have been improved from what it was earlier on in the war. But as far as the internal spaces of the house, that's something that soldiers would not have had access to. They would not have had the insight into what was going on in the headquarters and what was going on among the officer corps, because in the 18th century, the military is a representation of society as a whole. So you have those very rigid, clear demarcation lines between the enlisted ranks and the officer corps. So it would have been a whole other world to them that they would have been unfamiliar with, and that would have been almost alien to them in many ways. But yes, their lives would have been completely different from Washington and his fellow officers, as you're going to see when Louis Picone talks to that aspect of the house.
Okay, so our next question, Heian Kyung. Did Washington choose the Dye Mansion only for its vast property, which could house his troops, or were there other strategic measures involved in the choice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you, Dr. McMahon, for having me on the panel. I'd like to also welcome all of you and thanks for joining today. Just to reintroduce myself quickly, I'm Louis Picone, and I teach history at William Patterson University, and my specialty is within the presidency. So Washington, during the Revolutionary War, Washington stayed in 200 to 300 different locations as the focal point of the war moved from Massachusetts down south and then further up north again, up and down the eastern seaboard. And his aides de camp would act, in addition to everything else they did, they would act as a sort of travel agent for George Washington, and they would arrange his locations and his headquarters in advance. So the reason that George Washington had chosen Dye Mansion in 1780 was strategic due to the location. He felt that the location was secure in the Preakness Valley. It was also near forage, so near food and supplies for the soldiers. It was near the encampment site in Passaic Falls, and there was also soldiers encamped at Dye Mansion. As well as Jessica had mentioned in her video, George Washington knew Tunis Dye. So he had known Tunis Dye for several years. They had a lot in common. They were both large landowners. They were gentlemen farmers. They had both served in political office. They were similar in age. So he felt comfortable with Tunis Dye. He felt secure at the location. And also, Dye's home was near New York City. And very early in the Revolutionary War, after the British soldiers evacuated Boston, they had taken over New York City. So the British had occupied New York since 1776. And now this is 4 years later, and the British are still occupying New York. So Washington, throughout the war, had plans to retake New York. And he was just waiting for that perfect opportunity to do so. So Dye's mansion was close enough to New York City to give him, to put him in position if the opportunity arose to take New York City, which it didn't arise in 1780, nor did it arise until the end of the war when the British finally evacuated New York in 1783.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so definitely geographic. It was a great place to be geographically. And as Lewis mentioned, forage. So they were coming out of this awful encampment in Morristown. Washington was looking for ways to feed his troops as well. And this was really a concern of his. And the mansion sat on 600 acres, right? So it was farmland and forested. So there was definitely the ability for the troops to forage. So, yeah.
Jessica, the next question is for you. This is from Ian Marshall. Interesting factoid: revolutions are not necessarily popular events or indeed a majority rule proposition. What does this say about divided political opinions today and how we should interpret the chaos of current politics? 1 in 3 did not support Washington.
Wow. So 1 in 3 did not support Washington. About 1 in 3 supported the king, and about 1 in 3 stayed quiet. Right? So we had neutral, we had revolutionists, and we had loyalists. It's very much like today's political climate, I think, where you get very loud proponents of one side, very loud proponents of another side, and then you get a very loud silence from another faction of the population. I'm not quite sure how to answer your question to satisfaction without giving political views. So it's a great question, and it's definitely one that we can think about and maybe meet separately later to discuss a little bit longer. If you want to give us your information, we can definitely think about that one a little bit more.
Can I just add a little bit something as a historical perspective? I think it's a really good reminder. I think because of how the revolution ended, right? We just assumed that everybody was, in favor of it, right? And, and of course, so much of our national ethos, right, is is embedded within this, patriotism and sort of nationalism. But I think it is really significant to think about the ways in which, wartime experience could be very contested, right? A lot of shifting loyalties, a lot of attempts to remain neutral, right? That kind of middle third of people were people that just wanted to live their lives and not kind of get involved in the fray. And there are so many examples and experience of people who didn't get into the fray, but the fray got into them, right? So if a troops show up in your backyard and start taking your crops or your supplies, you might have a new opinion about the war, right? And are they paying you for those supplies or not, right? That might help determine your allegiance, right? So we kind of think about patriotic and political loyalty as being very sort of idealistic and aspirational and sort of, embodying the principles of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all great things, right? But the reality, the sort of granular level of daily experience and life, creates a much more nuanced, much more complex picture, I think much more interesting picture of how people understood and experienced and even shifted allegiances and loyalties depending upon how visceral and directly the war experiences was impacting their life. And in New Jersey in particular, there was a lot of troop movement and battles and activity, right? We're called the crossroads of the revolution because of how much activity took place in New Jersey. And so and I think that's why you have in New Jersey so we have very strong loyalist populations in places like Bergen County, right? Very strong patriotic moments, right? And key battles and things like that. So I think it makes New Jersey particularly central to the revolutionary experience. So just wanted to kind of add to.
If I may,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Just to kind of piggyback off of what Jessica and Dr. McMahon was just saying, I think another important aspect of this is that American national identity has always been something that has been contested and debated, right? So as Jessica and Dr. McMahon already kind of alluded to, there is embedded in the American national ethos this idea that there has always been consensus, right? There's always been this American consensus as to what our country is and what it's supposed to be. Who is included in that national identity, when in reality, from the very start of the American experience, if we can call it that, the nature of American identity has been something that has been contested and debated, right? So I think if there's a central strain through American history, it's that conflict, right? That dynamism that I guess is inherent in any kind of Republican or Democratic form of government.
And as we saw, like within the Dye family, right? So their daughter Jane is married to a loyalist. So within families, there wasn't a consensus like like we see kind of today, where you see people within the same family structure who have these very strong views that are different. You can also see the enlistment, the propaganda to join the Continental Army. You were going to receive things like food and clothing. So there were reasons why people joined an army that weren't necessarily political, but more about survival. And did the king offer you better stuff if you joined up with his army, or did the Continental Congress offer you better stuff if you joined up with theirs? There were people starving, there were people homeless, there were people who just needed to survive, and that's what their loyalties, that's how their loyalties were decided. So that also definitely played into this choosing sides. It wasn't necessarily a choice for most, I guess. You see within families, there was after the war, there was a woman whose husband had ran off and joined the king, but her son fought with the Continental Army. And after the war, they were going to seize her property because her husband had fought for the king. We actually don't know what happened to her, right, Kelly McManus? It was just like this newspaper article that we found that just sort of gave us this story. We don't know what the ending was, but they were going to take her property.
Yeah, as you kind of mentioned, she petitions Washington asking that the troops kind of stop pillaging her land, which then he orders that doesn't happen anymore. But afterwards, the local government after the war ends seizes her property, to which then kind of makes that happen with her asking, hey, my son fought in the war. Why are you taking things from me? Oh, your husband's name is on the deed. Everything you own is forfeit.
So
more
you
into
have
that.
the
Send me
greatest
that
army in
information.
well, you have the king's army was the greatest army in the world, right? So if the idea is I'm going to fight against the king, we're going to lose, and I'm going to be seen as a traitor, and they're going to take my property. Or if Washington and his troops win, but I didn't side with them, then I'm going to be seen as a traitor, and they're going to seize my property. So picking that side wasn't exactly like you woke up in the morning with this really great patriotic feeling. It was really survival.
Right. And I just want to kind of briefly mention another story, because something that Jessica said sort of made me think of the experiences of enslaved African Americans during the Revolution, right? The British Army promised freedom to African Americans who, ran away from their masters to join the British Army. So you have thousands of African Americans seeking freedom and liberty by joining the British Army, right? So it kind of shows you the complexity of the American revolutionary experience for enslaved individuals. The army that was offering them the chance for freedom, that was their war for independence, right? On a very personal level. And so it kind of shows you that there's just so many American revolutions, right? That there are, it isn't one story or one singular event. There's such a multiplicity of perspectives. And as Stephen Pellegrini mentioned, right, the experience could really differ considerably depending upon whose experiences you were thinking about or what you were fighting for, right? If you were fighting for your own chance to be free from enslavement, right? That's a pretty powerful motivating factor. And if your ability to run away from your master is being supported by the British Army, right? You're not just running away from enslavement, you're running towards the protection of the British Army, right? Just think about what a powerful incentive that was for thousands of African Americans who were enslaved during this time period.
And I think it's important to understand too that people's loyalty shifted during the war. It wasn't that patriots were patriots for the 7 years of the war. There was some people, depending on who was winning at the time or who was in their backyard, that the loyalties would shift to wherever, that they saw their loyalties would work out best for their future.
Can I also piggyback that there's also a lot of soldiers who are captured, usually given the option, you could go on and this is for the Continental troops, you could go on a prison ship out in the New York harbor, or you could take the King's coin and get paid and fed and clothed, a lot of things that the Continental Army wasn't able to provide. So there's a lot of flip-flopping there. Just for everyone, just to introduce myself, I'm Kelly. I'm the museum attendant here at Dimension. If you've come here for a tour in the past, you probably received the tour from me. So.
Okay. The next question is about the mansion itself. So Kelly, this might be a good one for you. This is from Maya Waiters. What is the most notable symbol of wealth in the Dye Mansion parlor?
That's a good one. Jessica's actually been working a lot more with the collections, but kind of not in terms of wealth.
Do you want me to take this?
Yeah.
I think she has an answer for this one.
Okay, so we can think about the symbols of wealth, not necessarily about how much things cost, but more about the things that you would have that would sort of make your life a little bit more comfortable than, say, other people. So if you had things like chamber pots, you were probably wealthy, because most people, pots were things you would then cook in. But to have a pot that you could actually go to the bathroom in meant you had more pots, right? So you had more things. Foot warmers, luxury. So the hearth, you're sitting in front of it, you can fill your foot warmer with some coals from the fire, and then you can go sit by the window and still be warm. Things were handmade, Things were commissioned. Things weren't things for everybody. So symbols of wealth were really more about the things that you might have had that made your life a little bit more comfortable than other people, and not necessarily how much things cost to make. So you could have a very expensive vase that maybe had been handed down in your family for 100 years that doesn't make you wealthy. But the number of vases you had, or possibly the fact that you had ones that were just for decorative and not for functional uses, like decorative items, that would have been a symbol of wealth. I hope that answers your question.
Right. And if I can piggyback off, and I don't even know if there's a way to just show me, since my background is the family parlor, and this is what I speak about in my video. So I really encourage the person to ask the question to watch my video in particular, because I focus on the family parlor, because that space is the space in the family home that would have conveyed those symbols of status that Jessica was just speaking about. And if you even look, things like the grandfather clock, right? And was that clock, imported from England, which was, may have been the case in the 18th century, right? That would have been a very highly visible marker, a sort of a status symbol. If you think about even today, right? What are the things that you have in your home, right? Or the certain kind of purse you have to own, or the certain shoes or whatever, things that, as Jessica said, the individual item is about conveying something, right? It's about signifying a certain status, a certain being, up on the latest trends, right? If you look behind me, there's a dress form, right? Was that fabric imported as opposed to homespun, right? That would determine the quality of the fabric, the luxuriousness of it, right? Again, just sort of these subtle markers that would indicate a family's wealth and status. And, and my video goes into sort of the rituals and the expressions of how that status and wealth would be conveyed in, entertaining and other sort of ways of enacting, so it's about sort of enacting and showcasing your place in the world. And that would be through these very subtle markers, but they would be very well understood, right? And, so those of you, think about it, particularly those of you who might be high school or college students, right? What's the bag everyone has, right? Or the shoes, right? Or the particular designer clothing or something, right? Those sort of markers that just sort of indicate a certain something, right? A sort of, you have that thing that everybody wants, right? And there's 18th century equivalents of that, right? So yeah, it's a great question.
Next question, I think, is an easy one. Anybody can grab it. During the time of Washington's stay at Dye Mansion, was Alexander Hamilton one of his aides de camp?
I can take that. Yes, he was. Yeah. So Alexander Hamilton was one of the 6 aides de camps that were with Washington at Dye Mansion. During that time, if you happen to see the play, Hamilton, this is when he was courting Eliza Schuyler, who he would marry later on in Albany. So there does exist love letters between the two going back and forth. But Alexander Hamilton was one of Washington's most trusted aides. So Washington would meet with his aides throughout the day. First thing in the morning, he would sit with his trusted aides. And then after they had breakfast, he would gather again with some of his trusted aides, while aides also worked on their own and Washington worked on his own. But Hamilton, along with Tench Tillman and Robert Harrison Henson, Robert Harrison, were among his most trusted aides that he would gather with. So yes, Alexander Hamilton was there.
When they encamp here in October and November, Hamilton leaves here to go marry Eliza at the end of November.
I just wonder if anyone else has now like Hamilton lyrics swirling around in their head now.
I thought the way Lewis said his name was very that Alexander Hamilton, but that might have been in my head.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is about the Dye family. Were members of the Dye family concerned about damage to their property by taking in revolutionary troops and risking an attack from the British forces on their home?
A really great question. I don't know that they were concerned about the risk. All of the sons were part of the militia. Their cousins, Richard Varick, they're a very military-based family. I think, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of primary source letters between the family discussing how they feel about things at this time, but I don't know that they were very concerned about the risk. I think for them, the risk was greater than, or the cause was greater than the risk, right? So I don't know that there was that much concern about damage to the property or to the home with this. I think it was more of an honor. I think they were probably pretty happy to have this event happen in their home. And I'm actually going to follow this up with something. My nephew watched the videos yesterday and he actually asked me about this. So I think this might be a great time to throw this in there in case anybody else was wondering. Washington didn't just show up at your house, knock on the door and say, hey, I'm staying and all my people are coming with me. There was a little bit of an ask involved. Most people didn't refuse it because if Washington was asking you to use your home, he knew that there was a very strong loyal tie. It wasn't just like a random, like, get out, I'm taking over. But for some houses, it was, get out, I'm taking over. But most people were okay with that if he was asking you to use your home. Some homes were smaller and people were displaced. They became almost like refugees while Washington used their house. But for the Dyes, I think they made the accommodations. I think that the family was probably happy to have him there. They were honored to have him there. And I don't know that there was much concern about what would happen to their home and property.
Yeah. And to add to that too, Washington paid often for the homes too.
That was another thing my nephew asked me. Yes, he did. He did pay you for the use of your home.
Yeah, and I believe he gave a $50 tip to Tunis Dye's servants too as well for his stay. So Washington wasn't paying that from his own pocket. Washington kept the expenses, and then the Continental Congress reimbursed Washington after the war. But he wouldn't just barge in the home and take over for the most part.
So you answered, but both of you answered the next question, which was, did Washington negotiate use of the Dye Mansion? So let me move on. Next question. At what point was Washington staying at the mansion during the war?
So he was there for July of 1780 and then again in October and November of 1780. He as Lewis had mentioned earlier, he was looking to attack New York, was hoping that was going to happen. He learns of the French arrival. Rochambeau arrives in Newport. So he leaves the mansion in August thinking he's going to attack New York because the British have left New York Harbor to go out towards where the French were. And right about that same time, he finds out about Benedict Arnold, realizes that he's not going to get New York. He doesn't know who to trust, and he heads back to the Dyes for October. That was a very quick military strategic explanation.
The next question is, did any battles occur near the mansion?
Yes. So one of the things I like to stress about Bergen County during the American Revolution is that it was a very central location. So we've already talked about how we're right outside of New York City, right? New York City is one of the largest port cities in North America at this time, if not the largest port city. So Bergen County lies between New York and where Washington's army is encamped at various stages of the war. So because of the fact that this is also a very prosperous agricultural area of New Jersey, meant that it was very strategically important. So if you were able to watch my video, the character that I'm kind of portraying is one of the hoppers from Bergen County. Basically, the town that I grew up in, Hohokus, was at that time Hopper Town, which was part of the larger municipality of Paramus. And there were at least 3 or 4 occasions during this part of the war alone, right? So basically 1780 to 1781, where the British basically invaded this part of the state to gather forage and supplies, because the British Army is fighting at the end of a 3,000-mile supply line, right? So everything that they need to get to fight the war comes from the United Kingdom. But the only way to kind of make that logistical situation better is to forage for supplies in Bergen County itself. So every time the British Army leaves New York to try to forage for supplies, they meet opposition from usually the Bergen County militia, because the Continental Army is the main fighting force of Washington. So they're not going to be concerned with the day-to-day fighting that's occurring in this area. Really, that responsibility is delegated to the Bergen County militia. So Bergen County would have been a constant battlefield. So if there was one battle I was going to point to, I couldn't really do that, but there was just this constant ebb and flow of battle that was going on in this area throughout the war.
Yeah, I could piggyback off that if you would like. There was one specific engagement in July, actually. So just like how the British are trying to kind of head out into New Jersey and gather supplies, the Americans are doing the same thing, because the most eastern parts of Bergen County are under the jurisdiction of the English. So at Bull's Ferry in New Jersey, Anthony Wayne is sent out with like 1,000 or 2,000 troops to go and secure, or the actual official thing was for him to destroy a blockhouse, this fortification that the British have. But in reality, they're stealing cattle, and they're able to make away with like a big herd of cattle that then the Continental uses to feed its troops. So.
Okay. The next question is, it was said previously that the Dye Mansion held 3 enslaved individuals. What were the conditions like for them? Did they receive the same privileges as other people in the mansion?
So unfortunately, we really don't know. We embarked on a pretty deep research project over the last few years trying to find answers to those questions. We really don't know what the lives were like of the people who were enslaved there. And we say probably 3 people enslaved based off of archaeological evidence and some of the like the tax records and things like that we've located. There's no primary source documents that help us to understand what their lives were like. We can make really great guesses and assumptions based off of what we can find, what it might have been like for people who lived in the area or who lived on neighbors' farms, things like that. But we really just don't know. And we know that the one woman's name was Phyllis because in Tunis Dye's will, he leaves Phyllis to his children. That kind of, with it, her name being there, it wasn't just like one Negro woman, which you see a lot if you think about inventories. But you see her listed as my wench Phyllis, and he leaves her to his children. Whomever decides to keep her, he gives more money to. So we can assume that she was pretty important in the family. She probably helped to raise the children. She probably was a pretty close servant to the family themselves, in addition to, cooking meals and doing the daily chores. She was probably a pretty integral part of the family. Now the others, we just don't know anything about. Again, we can make assumptions. There was probably men who would have helped with the stables and who would have helped with the carriages, helped with like maintenance around the house, that type of stuff. But we really just don't know what their living conditions were like. Unfortunately, what we've learned and what we continue to learn is that while the South has spent so much time researching their deep history of enslavement, and there's so much wealth of information that's already been dug up about the Southern states. In the Northern states, this is just like the tip of the iceberg, and we're really starting to try to piece this story together as best we can. And there's just not a lot of stuff that we can rely on yet. Like we're kind of like the first wave of research being done about these northern states and the northern sites that we have. And so again, it's basically making assumptions based off of what other sites have found. We can say during this time period, it was very much about keeping up with the Joneses. If your neighbors were doing it, you were. If your neighbors weren't doing it, you weren't. You didn't want to be the odd man out. So if we know something about local other families, we can then make those assumptions based off of that.
I think I'd just like to put in a plug for one of our previous Jeffersonian lecture series scholars, James Gigatini, who has actually published a book on the history of slavery and freedom in New Jersey. So he's one of this sort of new crop of scholars who are beginning to do those deep research dives into the experiences of slavery in the North. His book just came out, within the past 10 years. So it's fairly new, and he spoke in 2016. And his research into the practices of enslavement and freedom in New Jersey reveal that contested history that we've been talking about all along this morning, right? The states in the North after the American Revolution adopted either statutes either eliminating slavery or more likely gradually emancipation clauses. New Jersey was actually the last northern state to do so in 1804. And the amount of loopholes in the gradual emancipation acts of New Jersey led to, as Professor Gigatino's research has uncovered, there were still a handful of people who were still enslaved in New Jersey on the eve of the Civil War, because slaves in essence became he called them, I think, slaves for a term, right? So as opposed to practices of enslavement where, slavery was lifelong and hereditary and everything else, New Jersey kind of created this legal fiction of slavery for a term to cope with the gradual emancipation clauses. But often these terms were incredibly lengthy and contested. And so as Jessica mentioned, there is some really exciting new research, but a lot of it is some of it has to be, we don't have the archival information we would like. So a lot of it does have to be somewhat conjectural and speculative, but there is some really good work being done on this area, at least. And as just like the wartime experience in New Jersey was very contested and conflicted, the experiences of enslaved African Americans in New Jersey, both before, during, and after the American Revolution, were also very contested and conflicted as well.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
I was going to say, one of the interesting things that we did find based off of the research that we have done is that during the time of the Revolution, more of the population owned people. There were but few people enslaved per family. And that post-revolution, fewer people were slave owners, but those who were owned more. And if we look to the family who actually lived in the mansion, so the Dye family moves out around 1801. And the next family that inhabits the mansion actually has a lot of people enslaved on the property. There's a lot more evidence and a lot more, we've got birth records and names of that family that lived in the mansion after the Dyes do. But I just found that to be extremely interesting, that more people were slave owners, but owned fewer people. And then after the war, fewer people owned people, but they owned more.
So one thing I might add to that too is that in many cases after the revolution, the lives of slaves, certain individual slaves, actually became worse, because as slavery begins to phase out in the northern colonies, so Dr. McMahon was talking about New Jersey's program of gradual emancipation, the cotton-driven slavery in the Deep South is actually beginning to explode at this time. So there were legal loopholes. James Gigantino does some research into this, and he has an article about a particular municipal judge, Van Wickle, that was actually involved in reselling slaves from Bergen County and from New Jersey to New Orleans through the port. To Louisiana through the port of New Orleans. So just because these programs of gradual emancipation were in place doesn't mean that the experience was universal across the slaves in the state, because many of them were being sold to the Deep South, even though in actuality there was this state legislation allowing for gradual emancipation.
I can also add too that George Washington owned slaves, and so by the time of Washington's death, between his and Martha's estate, there was over 300 enslaved individuals that were owned by the Washingtons at Mount Vernon, and their experiences varied widely from field hands to those who would labor in the home, as well as Washington's personal manservant or body servant, who was William or Billy Lee, and who had been with George Washington going back to the Revolutionary War since the start of the Revolutionary War, and was with Washington at Die Mansion, we believe. So Lee's responsibilities would be to care for Washington's personal needs, and we know from his time at other headquarters that Washington would wake up early at 4 o'clock in the morning. Lee would be there with him to help him put out his clothes and fix his hair and get Washington ready for the day. So slavery was a very entrenched part of American history and New Jersey history and Washington's history at this time.
The next question is, what jobs would women of the house take on in order to serve the soldiers?
Good question. I mean, my sense is that the the women of the household, in terms of the actual die women, wouldn't have done much to help the soldiers, right? If anything, they would have, done some socializing, taken some dinners with them. But however, that said, what we have is a group of women who were known as the camp followers. And these were women who would kind of accompany the Continental Army and militias everywhere they went. Sometimes they were wives of soldiers, sometimes they were just women, looking to help support themselves. And these women would be, they would do laundry for soldiers, help cook meals, get supplies. They were sort of a thorn in Washington's side. I mean, he sort of saw them as necessary, right? But kind of grousled and grumbled about them. But we do know that at least some of them were paid for their work through the Continental Army. There is evidence of women receiving pay from the Army for this, and some great quotes from Washington, sort of, at first sort of complaining that the women slowed down the Army, but then the sort of growing recognition that without their help, the care and feeding and taking care of soldiers was very challenging and difficult. So he sort of, came to I think a begrudging appreciation of their roles. So it's a great story. And I think it's really important because it also helps to underscore one of the key themes that I think has come up in many different ways throughout our talk today, is right. The women who are sitting in the family parlor that I'm virtually sitting in right now would have experienced the wartime very different than women from lower classes who were, by economic necessity, engaging in this work of providing care for soldiers. Not to say that the elite women of the household, their lives were also disrupted, right? I mean, if you have a whole bunch of visitors showing up in your house, as Jessica mentioned in her tour, taking basically half your house from you, including your bedrooms and everything else, that is very disruptive, right? That creates a lot of challenges for your day-to-day living, but it's a very different set of challenging than the women who would be working as camp followers to provide laundry and food and other services for soldiers.
And to play off of that point about camp followers, today our Army has a logistical corps, right? So we have people who are responsible for taking care of these things that are professional soldiers. In the 18th century, the Army does not have those support troops. So camp followers, women, wives of soldiers are, again, to support Dr. McMahon's point, an integral part of the logistics. And you had said, Dr. McMahon, that the Army would not have functioned without those people following along, and it really wouldn't have. The Army would not have functioned without these people who congregated around encampments, military encampments.
So I'm going to do a plug for our next round of videos because we do have a first-person woman of the encampment interpreter to kind of give that story about what her experience is like. And, you know, for women whose husbands were enlisted and their farms were raided and they've got nowhere to go and the only thing they can do is go find where their husband is, it's where they made their lives. And, you know, just again to say what an integral part they were, things like washing and mending uniforms, you start to realize that health and cleanliness go together. If my soldiers are clean, they may remain healthy. And those who aren't healthy and the Army needs to move on, there are women here who can tend to them. So they did become this like really important part of everything that happened. And there is a lot of primary source documents and evidence that suggest that not only were women paid for their services, but they were actually like, here's a list of things we will do and how much each thing costs. And there were lists of grievances where they're like, hey, we did this work for this guy and he didn't pay us. And the guy got, you know, in trouble. He needed to pay them. So there's that evidence is out there. If you ever want to do any kind of a research project on it, I think it would be fascinating because that is there. You know, when there's so much stuff we look for and we don't find, but when there's stuff there, it's like, yes.
Okay, so the next question is, was the Dye family ever interrogated, arrested, or threatened by British forces for their involvement in revolutionary forces?
Not to my knowledge. Kelly?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
No worries. Was to sum it up, was the Dye family ever interrogated, arrested, or threatened by British forces?
No, that's the short answer.
Yeah, no, I don't think we've ever had any reason to believe that. Nothing's ever come up. You know, thinking about their daughter, Jane, again, we do know that Jane's living in Bergen County, married to a loyalist, which isn't something that you would, you know, be pretty happy about if you were Tunis. You'd be sad that your daughter's married to a loyalist, but you'd also be like, maybe do people think this is weird? Am I serving her information? You know, so there might have been some suspicions amongst people, but we just don't have any evidence that that was ever the case.
And I guess like the next, and this is something I've always asked myself, is the British knew Tunis Dye was that he was a revolutionary. They knew that he was running the Bergen County militia. So like the next question would be like, well, why didn't they just target him, right? Why don't they go after him? And I think the answer to that might be he's just too far in revolutionary territory to really be considered a high priority target, to waste a lot of effort in trying to reach him. Or that the Bergen County militia is just really good at holding its grounds. I was actually just explaining to someone who messaged me privately about like, with Washington staying at the house, would that have painted him as a big target, or the Dye family as a big target? But if you look at his letters, which are on Founders Online, Washington's always putting different like locations, be it like Totowa headquarters or Preakness headquarters,
near the falls.
Yeah, like as a secondary measure of protection, not only for the family but also himself. So there's a lot of security, kind of like today how we have like internet security and firewalls. They're doing the same thing back then.
Right. And there's also like just this interesting, I guess, sort of almost sort of 18th century conventions, right? Where there's, and I'm trying to think of the book. There's actually and I'm just blanking on it, but there's a scholarly study of loyalists in New York. And it's interesting because it's the scholar's name is Van Bursvik. So I wonder if there's actually a long connection there, and that's why she's interested in this topic, right? But she sort of talks about how, New York, which was occupied by the British for, most of the war, that there was actually a lot of movement of, people, particularly women, being able to sort of cross, troop lines for supplies or to visit relatives. And so there was more fluidity than we might imagine, right? I mean, this was a war, but there was also sort of like the everyday life. Like if there wasn't an actual active battle going on and people just, perhaps wanted to sell goods or visit a family member or something, there was a lot of movement back and forth, crossing enemy lines per se. And often it was women who were able to kind of have this fluidity of movement because they were, I guess, considered less threatening, right? There was this sort of 18th century idea that, if a woman said she was just there to visit her husband, that, that she wouldn't be doing anything more nefarious, even though we also know that women might have been involved in, smuggling and spying and everything else. But it was interesting how sort of a lot of those conventions of sort of polite society, particularly for elite women, if you had the right connections, you could travel in a way that might surprise us, right? That there was this sort of generous enemies is the name of the book, right? Because, and that's sort of the theme of the book, is that there was this sort of convention of sort of civility that enabled this sort of fluidity and movement across the borders, and particularly between New York and New Jersey, because of these sort of social conventions and mores, particularly for elite families, kind of just a realization and recognition that there were a lot of families with those kind of divided loyalties, right? A lot of families in which, in the Dye family, a woman's husband, put her on the other side of the war from her family. And that actually happened quite frequently, as particularly in this region, because this was such a contested region. So it's a really complex, really rich story, right? And I think, I think that's part of what we're talking about this morning helps to illustrate, is like when you actually get into those everyday stories, right? I mean, and sort of the experiences of wartime. It's so much more complex and nuanced and interesting. It really adds so much nuance to our understandings of everyday life in revolutionary America.
And I think, Stephen, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this too, but if we go back to the idea of what the militia in Bergen County, or the militia in the colonies prior to the war, right, this idea that militias were required. So every man who lived in a community or in a province or wherever, between the ages of 16 and 45, they were required to get together and practice military tactics, because the British weren't always going to be there to protect you if, let's say, the Native Americans started to attack or whatever. So you have this group of men and these groups of families who are so intricately entwined. You've got your neighbors and the people you go to church with, and your relatives, all working together. And then all of a sudden, here comes this war, and not everybody who's already been working together is going to be on the same side. And so now you've got these huge communities of people who are now divided. But you used to be best friends with this family, and your kids and their kids are best friends. And here are these now you're on taking these sides. And so even though you're in the same community still, you are now fighting for the British, and you are now fighting for the Continental Congress or Continental Army. So, when you think about being divided, one of the first things that I always remind students who come to the site is the British were already here, right? When this war starts, the British are already here. This was your government. These were your police officers. These were your protectors and the people who you bought your goods from, right? So it's not like you start a war with people who are then going to come across the ocean and then you're all going to be a front against them. It was this big muddled mess of who was going to side against whom. So Stephen, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
No, yeah, that's a really good point, because I think it's odd for us in a 21st century context to think of American society as a militarized society. But that's really what we're talking about, right? Is that males aged from, I think you had said 16 to 60, are required to enlist in the militia, because throughout the 18th century, France is an ever looming threat up until the 7 Years' War, 1750s. You have the Spanish to the south. You have Native Americans that are at various points in time in conflict with the English colonies. So, to your point, Jessica, the war doesn't simply start in 1775 and then suddenly there's this militarized society. That militarized society had been there for hundreds of years. This whole continent, North America, was a conflict zone. So to kind of put yourself in that position and think of yourselves and your neighbors and your classmates at school, right? And think about the fact that you would have all been familiar with each other, especially if you're 16 or older, through militia drill. This was a militarized society. And I just think that's a very interesting thing to think about in a 21st century context, because let's face it, in the United States, the military world and the civilian world are very segmented, right? They're segregated. You may have family members who are in the military, but there's a professional institution that deals with military affairs. Society, we don't really think about military things from day to day, but in colonial America, they did. So.
Right, and I want to just make a quick plug here for a book that I cannot wait to start reading. It's like my gift to myself for the break. It's actually from a friend of mine from graduate school. It's called The Boston Massacre: A Family History by Serena Zabin. And really, that's exactly what she talks about, is to speak more to Jessica's point, is, you know, the British military was here. They were a presence in colonial America. And what Professor Zabin's research has revealed is, in Boston at least, these soldiers, there were thousands of them stationed in Boston in the years leading up to the American Revolution. They married American women, you know, they lived with American families, they were their neighbors, they worked together, there was so much sort of familial and communal and interpersonal relationships that were embedded into these communities. And then with the Boston Massacre in particular, and then, rising colonial tensions, a lot of those family ties got fragmented, but a lot of them did not, right? A lot of them, people stayed families even if there were political divides. And so I cannot wait to read this book. I know a little bit about the research from seeing Professor Zabin at conferences and stuff, but I think it kind of helps us to reshape, just how much the personal, familial, social, daily living has shaped the experience of Americans during the war.
And it's important to understand. I'm sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
No, go ahead, Louis.
Yeah, no, just quickly, one is that today is the anniversary for the Boston Massacre, too.
Wow, so yeah,
Interesting
so.
Coincidence. 247 years. But also, it's important to understand that the war lasted for 8 years. So from 1775 to 1783. So there were these periods of tension and tension in communities and between patriots. But then over the years too, there was some relief of that tension. It was a contraction and expansion of warfare and of tension between communities. And regular life did go on in some ways.
Right.
General William Howe, who was in command of the British for the first part of the war, had lived most of his life in North America. So the man who was supposed to fight the American colonists had spent most of his life among American colonists. He knew many of them personally. So.
And I think another cool element looking at all of this in terms of looking at why people are fighting is that they're living in their own contemporary time. And their own contemporary time has a historical recollection of what's happening around the world and back in the home country. For instance, the Jacobite uprising in 1745 It was like a Scottish uprising. I think the French assisted them. That was put down brutally. So people deciding to take up arms against the English at this time know what happened. Like, they knew what happened in England, and they have to face the reality that, you know, their houses might be burnt down, entire families might be wiped out. There will be executions for treason. Like, this isn't something to take lightly, because, you know, there are a bunch of upset militiamen or something like that. Like, these are serious repercussions that are going to be happening. So like today we might think like, oh yeah, it was very easy for them to come to these decisions. It was not, no matter kind of what side on where they fall on the political spectrum.
There was a saying in the 18th century that the sun never sets on England, because there were so many colonies around the world that England could draw their resources from. So to fight against England was a pretty big undertaking, and it wasn't one that was taken lightly.
I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately we are almost out of time. So, just maybe we have time for one or two more questions before we do have to wrap up for today. So
I was thinking with the last few minutes, if anybody on the panel wants to give a summation or something that they want people to take away from today, I think that would be a great way to go. Okay, so nobody jumped.
Oh no, I'll
I think we're all being polite. We all want.
So I'll start, and then you guys can follow up with it. I think really the most important thing to do when thinking about a historical event, thinking about things in a historical context, is to really try to put it in the perspective of human experience. Human experience, and it's not all going to be the same experience. So how do you see multiple perspectives of the same event? And understand that, you know, like I think what we've all been trying to say is it wasn't a one track, this is what was happening in the 1780s for everybody, right? So being able to look at multiple perspectives of a particular event and really through the eyes of the people who are living it.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Jessica said. I think that's really the takeaway. I think it's actually so much more interesting and engaging and compelling in a way, right? Because this, you know, this is sort of the stuff of real life, right? And you know, I think it's, you know, I know as an educator, it's often, you know, it's relatable, right? And I just, this is what pops into my head, and it's sort of a little off topic, but I taught a class one time on women's history, and I assigned a book about Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, who was this woman who kind of caused a big scandal in the early 19th century by marrying Napoleon's brother, right? And I remember one of Steve, you were in this class, right? So and I remember one of the students said, you know, oh, he's like, I can relate to her. You know, she was petty, and, you know, she had all this scandal and all this gossip and stuff like that, you know, like it, you know, it kind of grabbed this person who was maybe like, you know, maybe didn't want to hear another like sort of boring history story kind of thing, and made them realize that history is the stuff of life, right? And the stuff of life with all its sort of contradictions and conflicts and complexities, you know, that's what gives meaning and texture and, you know, drama to our own lives, right? And, you know, it would be a mistake for us to think that 18th century people lived these sort of neat, uncomplicated lives, right? Their lives were incredibly complicated, particularly when they were intersecting with, you know, major troops and battles and military engagements and political loyalties and shifting allegiances. And I just think it makes for such a rich, complex and really fascinating story, and I think helps to bring the past to life. And just to give a plug for a place like Dye Mansion and other historic sites, is they really do help bring the past to life, right? There's something about being in that space or interacting with material culture, seeing those bedpans or that candlestick, or, you know, and just really getting a sense of what life was like. So I really hope that once this pandemic is behind us, that you all take the opportunity to visit Dye Mansion and other historic sites throughout the state. There is so much rich history just sort of right in our own backyard. And these sites are just really wonderful and help to bring the past to life in such wonderful ways. So I really hope that I'll do that as a plug for for visiting all of these wonderful sites that are sort of right in our backyard.
Speaking to the lived experience of history too, I'll give a little plug here for historical reenactment, because that's something that I'm involved in. And you know, New Jersey and Bergen County specifically really is as it has been called before, the crossroads of the American Revolution. This is the center of the American Revolution. It's fought in New England, it's fought in the South, but this is really the heart of not only the military history of the war, but also the social history and so forth. So if there is one thing, as Jessica and Dr. McMahon had already said, that I would encourage you to do, is take advantage of the rich history that we have in our area, because it's something that a lot of other parts of the United States don't really have. So if you think of traveling to Europe, for example, right, you think about the history that's there. There's plenty of history that's right in your own backyard. So there's no lack of places for you to visit and experiences for you to investigate. So to kind of just play off that point, yes, definitely take advantage of local historical sites like the Dye Mansion, because you could learn a lot.
Yeah, and George Washington stayed in dozens of places throughout New Jersey, none longer than Dye Mansion. So there is just incredible history here in New Jersey, and you have the leading figure of the Continental Army and one of the leading figures in American history right here in our backyard. So at the end of my video, tying this back, someone asked about Hamilton earlier. I kind of tied back at the end of my video and I mentioned the song, "You Want to Be in the Room Where It Happened." For Dye Mansion and for George Washington, those were the rooms where it happened for 3 months of the Revolutionary War. So definitely, I encourage you to go there. Not just a virtual field trip, an actual field trip.
Oh, I want to thank my panelists, and a special shout out again to Jim Miles for being our superb technical assistance during this, and moderator for the questions that came in. And thanks to all of you for attending and for your really fabulous questions. I mean, I think it's evident that you really asked great questions that sparked such wonderful conversation. And I could sit here all day and keep talking about this stuff. And unfortunately, our time today is over, but please keep in touch with us and the folks at Dye Mansion. As Jessica said, we have other videos planned. We have other programming planned for the spring, other lectures and events. So I hope that this is just the start and the beginning of continued conversations on these great, important topics. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if any of the educators out there, even if we do it outside, if you want to come by, let me know, and we can do an outside introduction.
Thank you. Great to see you all.
Thank you.